By the end of this video, you should have a good understanding of what happens when a sufficient condition fails. This is a topic that a lot of new test takers struggle with. So to jump in, we first have to talk about valid versus invalid conditional statements. In logic, everything is binary, either true or false. Likewise, conditional statements are either valid or invalid. Let's look at the definitions. Whenever the sufficient condition evaluates to true, the necessary condition also evaluates to true. That's what it means to be a valid conditional. And note that this definition of validity does not include what happens when the sufficient condition is false. In other words, if the sufficient condition is false, the conditional rule is simply not triggered and it can't be violated. Invalid. A conditional statement is considered false or invalid only if it is possible that the sufficient condition is met, but the necessary condition fails. And this scenario where the sufficient is met yet the necessary fails, that's called the rule breaker. That's the only way of violating a conditional rule. Let's look at a simple example. If that's a sufficient indicator, if the ADCOM meets this week, you will receive a scholarship. So we'll diagram ADCOM meets this week as A. Arrow, you will receive a scholarship. We'll diagram that as S. This conditional would be invalid if it is possible that the ADCOM meets this week and yet you do not receive a scholarship. Next, let's talk about the concept of vacuous truth. In logic, a vacuous truth is a conditional statement that is valid because the sufficient condition is not satisfied. In other words, in scenarios where the sufficient condition is false, the conditional statement is not contradicted irrespective of how the necessary condition behaves. Let's look at the same example that we had on the last slide. If the admission committee meets this week, then you will receive a scholarship. What happens if they don't meet? So A evaluates to false. Using this concept of vacuous truth, this conditional would be considered valid under this scenario, irrespective of whether or not you receive a scholarship. It's not relevant. Okay. Let's look at a couple of more extreme examples using this concept of vacuous truth. And I really believe that if test takers understand this concept, they will stop being confused about what happens when sufficient conditions fail. So if the sufficient condition is a must be false statement, the conditional statement is automatically valid. Here's an example. If you swim across the Atlantic Ocean in 5 minutes, then I will give you the moon. This is surprisingly, in logic, considered a valid conditional because the sufficient condition is a must be false statement. You cannot swim across the Atlantic in 5 minutes. And so this rule is actually never triggered. So I'll never be in a situation where I actually need to deliver you the moon, which of course is also impossible. In example 2, if 2 plus 2 is 5, don't mind the dollar signs there, they're clearly in the wrong places. If 2 plus 2 is 5, then the moon is made of green cheese. Well, 2 plus 2 is not 5. So this rule is never going to be applicable, and we would describe it as vacuously true, meaning it is a valid conditional. As ridiculous as it looks in logic and on the LSAT, this would actually be considered a valid conditional statement. Okay. And I'll just flip back to the first slide for a second. The reason for that, again, comes down to the definition of invalid. It means something very specific. It means that it's possible for the sufficient condition to pass, and yet the necessary condition fails. In these examples, as silly as they look, it is not possible that the sufficient condition passes. So you can't satisfy the definition of invalid. Okay, let's look at truth tables. This is not directly tested, but I do think that understanding this is helpful on the exam. So when you have two conditions, A and B, there's only 4 possible true-false scenarios. Let's lay them out. true, 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 false, false, true, and false, false. Okay, those are the 4 possible scenarios. And let's look at how the conditional behaves in each one. So in scenario number 1, the conditional is satisfied, it's valid. And you can call this the kept promise. Okay. When the sufficient condition is true, the rule is triggered, the necessary must be true, and that's exactly what's happening in scenario 1. In scenario 2, the sufficient condition is true, so the rule should be triggered, but the problem is that the necessary condition fails. So this evaluates to false. This is the broken promise. Okay. Now, if scenario 2 can be attained, then you have an invalid conditional statement. In scenario 3 and 4, the sufficient condition is false, so the rule is not being triggered, and the conditional is trivially satisfied. And this is what we previously described as vacuous truth. I'll just use an abbreviation, VT, vacuous truth. Okay, let's look at one more example. Your insurance claim will not be denied unless the police report is missing. The conditional indicator here is unless. The not is functioning as negation. Again, with unless, you negate the sufficient condition, since it's starting off as negative, it would become positive. So your insurance claim, if your insurance claim is denied, I can diagram that as D. Then the police report is missing. Okay. Now, let's look at what happens when the claim is not denied. Okay, the claim is not denied. Well, the rule is not being triggered. So, let's say the let's say the police report is missing. The conditional statement would be valid because it would be vacuously true under that scenario. Likewise, if the claim is not denied, meaning it's paid, and the police report is not missing, again, the conditional would be considered vacuously true and valid. So if this is false, if the sufficient condition is false, it doesn't matter what happens with the necessary. It could be true or false. And either way, the conditional would be considered valid.